So it's great to be here with all of you. I'm a substitute for Christina Sharp. I'm Saidiya Hartman, and I met Charles Gain 2 hours ago, and so this is our first public conversation, which I'm very much looking forward to. So I thought I would just start by asking Charles to talk about the development of the work and its making and its history, and then we could explore a range of conceptual and political questions that are articulated by the work. Yeah.
Sure. The project started as a proposal for a commission that was supposed to be located in St. Louis along the Mississippi River. And so when I went out there to inspect the site, I got the idea that I want to make an object, or I was going to make a proposal that tried to engage the environment that's in St. Louis by the river, because there's the banks of the Mississippi there, and behind that is the Saarinen Arch, and behind that is the courthouse where the Dred and Harry Scott trials took place. And so I wanted to make a piece that engaged that history, those narratives. And so I went down to the river, and I saw various objects that you'd find at a port-type site. It was a site that's not operative anymore as a port, but there are old chains and pieces of wood. So there are a number of things that I saw. So I just started making note of that. And so the basis of my work in general, and they describe moving change as part of a body of work that I call the language pieces, is to put things together that are unrelated. Now, of course, you can form a relationship by saying that anything, particularly at that site, has a built-in relationship, and that's fine. But I was interested in individualizing or individuating the objects there. And two things that I noticed is that, surprisingly, there were ships. It's shocking, I know. And there were chains. There are a lot of other things, too. Like Coke bottles and things like that. But I saw those two things, and I thought that individually they are autonomous objects in relationship to each other. So I just tried to think of how to build something that I guess you would call an assemblage based upon these objects. And what you see as the moving chains is really an attempt at bringing together within the same space chains and what we would call the hull of a vessel or a barge. So I made it, and the original one that I made, in the creative time people know this to be true, was supposed to be 300 feet long. And it was supposed to have 12 chains, and of course, like that hyperbole, I didn't know what I was doing. But over time, in working with the piece, we realized that 300 feet was a little ridiculous, in fact, a bit impossible. And over time, the idea shaped to be an object of about 150 feet. We brought that down to 110 feet as it is now, and 9 chains. And the structure itself, that structure came to me almost immediately. The shape of that you see now is really, like a geometric structure, the top of which are chains. And so the roof was a place to place the chains as an object, and what you would call the hull was the place where we could isolate or associate barges and ships. And of course, it took almost 10 years because the project moved from St. Louis and to other possible sites and ultimately winding up here. So it took 10 years for that to happen and for it to be built. The idea of the piece had been already put together 8 years ago, and very little changes from that point to today. And so what happened today is that we found the means and the facility to build it.
Many people have described, they've used terms like open and ongoing to describe moving chains. And I too have that, that's my sense when I encounter it, that it is, you know, not really a historical work. If we think of a historical work as defined by a certain fixed conception of the past, and if it is a monumental work, it's a counter-monumental work at the same time. So I don't know if you would just articulate some of the open questions of the work. In one interview, you said in reference to the Dred Scott versus Stanford decision that the trial is still ongoing, that, you know, the decision is still unfolding. And certainly, you know, I thought about that in regard to the remarks of the previous panel in terms of abolition in its many meanings. But maybe you can talk about like some of the ongoing questions that you hope to articulate in the work. And then we could also think about abolition as both horizon and abolition as also enclosure.
Yes, the object I don't consider a monument in respect to the idea that mostly we think of monuments as a sign or a trope to a very specific event or thing or experience. And as you say, that the work for me operates in a much more sort of a multivalent way that monuments are intended to work. And the openness has to do with what the way that I generally dealt with the idea of machines. I made several machines in my career, so this is another one, and all of them are repetitive. They all do the same thing over and over and over again. And the way that works is that it's intended to nurture or conjure a space of discourse or interpretation through the repetitive experience. And in this case, it allows us to get to a point where we can have two relationships with the object. One as an abstract structure, that is an assemblage, but the other as an object, a very specific object, although abstract, but one that becomes a focal point for certain discursive experiences or discursive activities. In this case, those discourses come from the site that was originally intended, that is that bringing in narratives from the courthouse where the Dred and Harry Scott trial took place, narratives with regard to the Mississippi River, narratives having to do with the Saarinen Arch. The Saarinen Arch narrative, of course, is the manifest destiny, and how that manifest destiny, the idea of manifest destiny, becomes a very central part of the idea of the American economy, American capitalism, which I mentioned that is based upon the abuse of enslavement of labor. Getting work accomplished for little or no money. So it was built upon that idea, and so the work is intended to be a space that integrates these various narratives, that they seamlessly move in and out of each other, and they seem to have a relationship. It begins, of course, I said that the objects that stimulate this narrative are individuated objects, that they are as metonyms, as things, they're unrelated. We attach relationships to them. And the idea of repetition helps facilitate the ability to make those attachments.
And I guess, I have a question about that. I mean, I know over the course of your practice, issues like, affect, intentionality, the subject, have, been the subject of your critical interrogation, as well as, I guess, the taxonomy of value that's connected to the universal in aesthetics and an enlightenment project. And I feel like in the earlier work, so much of the critique of affect was related to conception of the artists and their kind of expressive intentionality, or some notion of the organic character of the artwork and how it makes the viewer who encounters it feels. In this, I feel a shift in Moving Chains. And so maybe you would disagree and say, Saidiya, you're totally off base here. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting to me about this work is that it also articulates conceptual questions, but it seems that those conceptual questions are intended to produce an effective experience for the person who enters the structure, so that affect seems like it's allied with a critical project, and not that affect is the object of critical scrutiny. So do you think that the relationship of those terms have changed over the course of the practice? Is there something about dealing with this particular history that that has kind of, maybe led to a kind of a recalibration of what an effective encounter might enable? I don't know.
Oh, man. I'm going to, it's not that you're wrong, but I'm going to talk about the way I perceive that history of practice, and that it's certainly true that the issue of affect has been central to my conceptual strategy. I mean, it's different. I mean, in the talk this afternoon, the panel, that amazing panel this afternoon, where I thought, listening to him, I said, I don't have to come up here. So I heard that one person, Torquazi, had talked about one aspect of it, which I think is totally relevant, and that is that she went beyond the object to the materiality of the structure and the phenomenon the sensual or sensible phenomenon of the structure and its engagement with the environment. And one of the other panelists talked about the meaning that becomes attached to it, and how feeling is attached to that meaning. So my idea is always to, and this is particularly in terms of creating a space where these things come together, is to attach the idea of meaning, which really is an intellectual faculty or activity. The idea of meaning with the sense experience through the material and formal properties of the object. My idea was to bring them together, to make this claim that you can't talk about the way you feel about something without also having a thought about it. And this is just generally I was using this to critique the modernist idea of a work of art as having a modern work of art is essentially the purpose of a modern work of art is to produce an affect that comes from your subjectivity, that it's the materialization of your subjective space, individualist space. And I wanted to critique that idea because I don't think that's true. Because you can't do that. I mean, you don't know where your subjectivity is. It isn't a thing. And because it isn't a thing, it's something that has been able to sort of occupied by modernism to describe a work of art as a work of art because you can't talk about it or think, or it is an experience of thinking. So I wanted to critique that idea by showing or creating a situation where you can't unlink the thought from the feeling. So that's why I thought that panel was really good, because it really presented both this binary, and my interest is to bring this binary together. So even in the grid work, the sense experience produced by color and form is combined with the intellectual experience of gridding, the mathematical experience of gridding an object, in order to create a situation where you can't separate what you experience sensibly from what you're thinking. And in the language pieces, like in this one, the structure is, it's not a boat. I mean, at no point is it a boat. Does it take on that iconic? It takes on an iconic reference, but it isn't the object itself. Like if you actually made a boat. All right. So, but no point is it not, this sort of elongated cube with slanted sides. Or is at no point is it just chains, because it becomes that structure that those metonymies become decomposed by the experience of it, and I think that is where I think my critical aim is occupying. That it's intentional. That I'm trying to say that, and this goes into why I'm not interested in calling it a boat or a monument, because essentially it is a space that is the manifestation of an in-betweenness, an in-between what we consider the substantial binary that modernists propose between intellect and feeling.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that the previous panel offered us was the way of thinking about the structure as both an enclosure and an opening and a way through. It seems that in relation to the particular, conceptual terrain, or in relationship to the field of slavery and abolition, maybe I'm having this like radically utopian reading of Moving Chains, and that is, how might it be possible to think at all or to think differently about, this long duration of enclosure, to think about this history of racial capitalism, when so many of the terms which make possible our thought keep on reproducing the enclosure. And it seems that there's something about the material effects of inhabiting that structure that Torkwasi points out, and if we think about, affect as kind of, a sensory and embodied knowledge, but that may be precognitive or pre-linguistic, that maybe that's a way to think beyond or outside of enclosure, outside of these kind of constitutive, binaries. And I want to think about this very particularly in relationship to your work on, Harriet and Dred Scott. The previous, panel was, specifically on abolition. I mean, for me, one of the most pernicious aspects of the decision in that case is not only that, Black people have no rights that need be recognized by whites, not only declaring that Black people are non-citizens, but the way that they do that is precisely by, underscoring the radical limits of abolition as a project, because they say, let's look in fact at those states which have rushed ahead towards abolition. Let's look at Connecticut, let's look at Massachusetts, and how constitutive anti-Blackness is in those places, even where we have something like the formal eradication of slavery. We still have an inferior and servile race. We still have this conception of, of the Black as kind of like outside the order of the human. And so even the thought before it happens on the national scale, it's almost like they have figured out a game that's going to make abolition, in fact, possible, but maintain a racial hierarchy of man that's always going to reproduce, Black life as imperiled, as fungible, and as disposable. So that's why it's like so it seems that your conceptual propositions, they intend to do more than simply underscore the paradox, but I feel like to try to kind of like push us beyond them. Am I overreading the kind of, the formal articulation of the work? So that's one question. And then given the terms of that decision, what does it mean to kind of transpose something like that into a compositional score? So what are the critical stakes of your sonic practice and your practices of transposition?
With respect to the first question, and you will remind me of the second one. the one of the experience. I'm old enough to have lived under Jim Crow laws, and I think that there is, and it's like Edward Said said about the colonial mind, the post-colonial mind, right? Is that it is an identifiable, critical space that is wholly and tied to your lived experience. And so if that lived experience is living in the Jim Crow South, then that there is an identifiable, I could say, discursivity that grows out of that lived experience. And so I lived in the Jim Crow South, and my sister's here, and she did too, And one of the things that I thought, I didn't come to this thought until, because I left Charleston when I was 5, and I didn't come to this thought till I was 6. But that thought was that any of the rules and orders and structures that white people thought as normal, in the way that you described it, the normalization of black inhuman, the inhuman, the black is a non-human, and to white people that was a normal expression of the environment, but with black people it never was, right? So but if it wasn't, then what was the space? And I thought that what that space was a space where nothing makes sense. I mean, it was hard to link things together so that it created a space of the normal. And I think this is a product of the mind of the marginalized or the oppressed, or a personality that lives under white supremacy. And I think this is peculiar to minority people, not just black people, but minority people. We lose sight of that because we're struggling against that white supremacy, and you think that is a very concrete ideological space. But I learned that even that space of struggle, it doesn't, as an expression of it, isn't satisfactory because it produces problems too. Like for example, so when I looked at the rules around Jim Crow, this doesn't make any sense because none of the things that for me seemed to line up, and so I think that I carried that perception into my adulthood, where I said I made this realization I was 6, but I was a little older than that. That I carried that into my adulthood, where I had this great suspicion about representation, and had the feeling that it was, more based upon, of course, a set of learned ideological terms and constructs than it is about what is real and what is not real. And but I still thought that was the privileged space of the minority person, and so I thought that in the way that I deal with art and deal with making objects, I try to simply continue what I was thinking at the time. And what we're talking about is a space of misalignment that you align. But your ability to align, you have what we say a greater freedom of realigning. You understand that the realignment is a construct and a fiction, but you have a greater space of real alignment than those people who find that what they describe, like in the description or definition of the black person, as normal. They're incapable of seeing it as the space of misalignment because they haven't lived under oppression. right? I just thought I was just carrying on from this position, and my description about how I put the work together is an attempt to explain how those thoughts I had as a younger person transferred into my work, and so I forgot the second part of the question.
I'm gonna have a little preface to it. I guess you have been involved, from the beginning in a political critique of the terms which make thought and sight possible. Would you so? And even as a more discernible, legible political object came into view as part of the political critique in terms of the movement from the grid works to the more text-based projects, there seems to also be a kind of hesitancy or skepticism about the terms of political legibility itself, about a kind of predigested rhetoric of politics that the work seems to, take up, even when it's dealing with explicitly political documents. And the second question was about the politics of transposition. So in manifestos, you have these 4 radical political documents, a Black Panther Party 10-point program, a Situationist International Manifesto, International Socialist Conference, Congress, and a Zapatista document, and they're transposed into music, again with Harriet and Dred Scott. So I guess I just want to know more about the provocation of that kind of transposition as well as its promise. I mean, I think that clearly there's a kind of amplification with a difference that's involved in that transposition, but I just want to hear more about that practice and what, I don't know, do other political horizons come into view? Is that a way of kind of destabilizing the terms of political projects?
Yeah. Well, the reason that piece comes out of an idea that had its germ in an earlier work. So in the grid work, the mathematical system that I used to help create a series that unfolds in a certain kind of way by layering the shape of different trees on top of each other. It allows us to deconstruct the tree as an object and allows us to occupy this abstract space as well as the space of the object. But one thing is that you know at all times that the image that you see as an object makes no sense in relationship to the image that you see as a set of grids and numbers. At the very least, it raises questions about how is it that we perceive the object, because ultimately, even in terms of our perceptual apparatus, the object that we see is a aggregate of textures, and so we say, at what point does the one turn to the other, or is the tree simply introduced to us cognitively in our cognitive realm as an illusion? Is it always that? The question is it always there? So, in the manifestos, rather than using a grid, I used the music system. And I said earlier that in that work I would bring together 2 things that were unrelated. So in this case, the intellectual framework of the system of music or music theory operates like the grid in terms of depositing sounds, in sequences that when you hear it sounds like music. Then, but by engaging, in order to engage two things together, I take the text, those texts that you described, and use the system to translate the letters of the text into musical notes. And so I can safely say that the melodies that you hear as a consequence are produced by the text. We can call that arbitrary or random, but it nevertheless is produced by the text. What seems to be compelling is that what you hear as music seems to be intentional. So you have to square that with the arbitrary system that I use to form it. Like the grid, it creates a space of paradox, and that I think that is resolvable, but not by objectifying the experience. That is, at some point, you embrace the idea that what you experience is paradoxical. You embrace it. You said that where there's no space of the real, actually, against the space of fiction, it's that there's a space of paradoxical, and they work obviously well together because what you hear is something that you can sensibly and intellectually experience.
And so is it then just about the kind of, I don't know, like a kind of a structuralist project about the arbitrariness of meaning, or is there also something that happens when a listener is then perceiving this meaningful score, right? When that music is acting upon a listener, you noted the dissonance between maybe the tenor of a manifesto, which has a kind of emphatic, insistent quality that's trying to engender a new now, and the seemingly elegiac sound of the score that is the consequence of its translation. Is that an attempt to just underscore, again, the motor of meaning making and its arbitrariness to which we assign meaning, or is it a kind of isn't it an inducement to thought? Is the paradox, I feel like what you want us to do is not simply to observe the paradox, but the paradox is part of a decolonial project, the paradox as an impetus to not only kind of recognize the structures that are producing meaning, the prevailing taxonomies of values, but ultimately is that paradox related to Ronaldo's call to riot, riot, riot. So I guess I'm really just kind of trying to push you more about the stakes and the longings of the work.
And the big picture for me is that I want to, and this goes back to this critique of subjectivity, but it's a general critique of normativity or the transcendentalism, and any idea of a totalizing theory, because I think totalizing theories are part of white supremacy. So I want to critique that, to say that there's no theory and there's no construct except perhaps in the rigorous laws of physics that's totalizing. But nevertheless, we're given the idea that the whole impetus of education is based upon the ability to base knowledge on totalizing thoughts. And since I think totalizing theories are essentially racist, I wanted to create an experience that does not deny or does not suggest that we can't live in a space of knowledge production. That in fact I'm trying to suggest that we can, and in fact that space of knowledge production is really happening in the absence of totalizing theory, or it can, that totalization actually becomes a buffer or a wedge against knowledge, as we were saying before, in terms of ideology. And so that's my big picture. And so that's offering a critique. All right, and you can see, and one can appropriately call that a political critique based upon my intention to disable a certain kind of idea. But that critique has to be convincing, not just as a speech, but it has to be convincing as a combination of thought and experience. So what happens is that the paradox, I think, I may be wrong by this, the paradox that's produced in the experience of the work does not make the work illegible or chaotic or deny, or even, it's very easy to address it as a lived and living experience or a lived and living object. Now, so I'm imagining that in the big picture, this is the way knowledge is produced. All right, and I was saying that in terms of the minority lived experience, that this is the space where minority discourse is produced. And so that's my belief. Now, the only time, because when people look at the work, they tell me, these, they come back to me with these affective responses, or the metaphoric narratives that they're able to develop around the experience that they had. And when I hear that, I celebrate it, because I think that it essentially proves that it is an experience that you're having that you can actually communicate to others. But at no point can you understand exactly. Let me put it this way: that you understand it without denying the paradox that presents it to you. In some cases, people who deny it because they call me a liar. I mean, so when I say that the music is made by a randomizing system, they just call me a liar because it goes against what they're experiencing.
No, and I don't, I understand that, and, obviously a physicist would say we're constantly making meaning of patterns of randomness all the time, so I understand what, engenders your, the kind of the rigorous systemic work. You, say this thing which I really like, that's, you make thoughts and concepts with materials, and for you, theory is actually essential to lived experience. You can't think of kind of like lived experience outside of theory. So it's not that your underscoring of paradox is to say that there's a kind of a fundamental dissonance in the work, and maybe I will ask you about, with moving chains in particular, use the word trauma and traumatic in your description of it. So maybe you can talk more about, trauma in relationship to the kind of the constitutive paradox, which I agree with you, which describes the experience of the Black living in modernity. I would say that's a fundamental description. Yeah.
Could you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So when I was designing the piece, the experiential possibilities of the materials I was looking at. I mean, I was aware. And I have a problem with the term imagination, but in my imagination, I was aware of what the potential was, and the other machines that I made, sound and sound experience, were all very essential, and so I was naturally thinking of the objects as sound producers, and so I thought that as I was putting this structure together, I thought that it would be actually more aggressive as an experience than it wound up being, so I treat the idea of sound as a similar component as other formal properties of the object, in that sound is essentially can be abstract. It can be literal, because you like that plane just went on. You hear that sound and you say it's a plane. It's not a seagull, right? So it can be literal, but the sound can very easily. We can very easily relax into the realm of abstraction with any sound. So we don't have to identify the pattern of sound that's produced by that plane as a plane. We can easily get into an abstract space, and I thought of sound that way, and I thought of the shaping of forms to produce the assemblage that way. The so I'm sorry, I think I lost.
So in terms of the ferociousness, because you also described that you wanted, you know, the person who encounters this space to experience what are the critical consequences of being under that ferociousness and passing through that space.
Yeah, so I have to underscore the idea that that I don't really know how these things are actually going to work, you know, or what the experience is going to be, because I rely so heavily on chance. You see, and so what I imagined was you could have failed as much as succeeded, because the structure, the object itself is so reliant on chance that fundamentally, I was going back to the fact that dealing with the chain and the geometry of the barge, it's an arbitrary conflation. You know, I was criticized in an article once by saying that, you know, those objects, it's just hard, that if I think I'm operating from the space of chance and indeterminacy, the narratives of slavery are so already built into those objects. But my contention is that they're not already built. Nothing's already built into an object. What is built into it, especially narratively, is the context that we see or use the object. That is, and so there's always options to that in that regard. That's the space of chance that I think that I'm operating, that I operate in, and so the result is that, and going back to what I was saying about you know, how the minority subject exists within a more highly abstract space than the majoritarian subject. The sense that I got of what this would, I didn't have any sense of what this sound would produce as an experience. So, but the sense that I got of being able to focus on those abstract properties of the materials, I think, comes from that space that I described. I didn't realize until what was happen, or the experience that many people seem to have with the piece. I didn't realize that at all until I turned the piece on, until we turned the piece on. That you know, even though I had the sense that it's going to be a challenging piece in terms of sound, I didn't know what that would produce as an experience, at least particularly as a cognitive experience as well as an aesthetic experience. I didn't know what I was going to do, what I was going to produce. I was just going to have faith that it was going to produce something. Once it was turned on, my ability to articulate a critique about it got a lot better. But I just didn't know before. And this is a space that I really want to have. You know, because I have the same suspicion about approaching works of art as a totalizing within the space of totalizing constructs, as I have about the general idea of culture as being victimized by totalizing theories.
Is there time for one more question? Yeah, and I guess in terms of your practice, which might be you know, described as a decolonial practice because, again, as I said, there's been this, you know, target on a conception of the universal of art and of aesthetics.
That was the CIA.
So your rule-based approach or your use of random systems to generate work, I mean, would you feel that to describe that as a kind of a decolonial or even an abolitionist practice is to put a label on it that's too uniform, or can we understand that like kind of ongoing critique of a universal project, that ongoing critique of the kind of absolute self-certainty of a Western ontological project? Can we understand that as abolition, or can we be involved with that project without naming it as such?
Well, I mean, this may sound like a contradiction, but no, it has to be named as such. That it's intentionally that. I mean, it all starts with my perception of Jim Crow laws. It comes out of that experience. So I think I'm still responding to that experience. So it comes out of that. And I also, wanted to establish that there is the mind of the person who still lives the experience under suppression. It's constantly talking about that in the most abstract sense. That abstract, semantic, syntactic space. Even though it's abstract, it still comes out of this very cultural frame, and so I very definitely see it as part of the decolonizing. Part of the that I'm one of many people who are part of the decolonizing project.
Well, thank you. So should we end there? Thank you very much.